I am Rotimi Suberu, and my institutional affiliation is Bennington College in Vermont, the United States of America. I think pluralism is the constructive governance or management of diversity and difference. So it is not a synonym for diversity. It is actually the management, the constructive management of diversity in a way that is supportive of social peace, of national security, of economic prosperity. So I will define pluralism as the constructive governance or management of social diversity. And I speak as a political scientist, as somebody who studies political institutions and processes. I would say the most important driver of pluralism, of the constructive governance and management of diversity, is political development. And by political development, I mean, basically three things. One, you have to have a state, a coherent, viable state that has a monopoly over the instruments of violence. I think that is absolutely important for driving pluralism. You have to have the rule of law. Rule of law means that the law is applied equally to people. There's no discrimination in the application of the rule of law. And finally, you have to have accountable government, what some call democratic government. And that means government that works in the interest of the people, not in the interest of the rulers. Government that is accountable, that is responsible to the people. In a diverse society, that will mean multiple ethnic communities. So you need a government that is accountable to the people. So I would say political development in those terms. In terms of a state where there's a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence, in terms of accountable government, in terms of the rule of law, I would say those are extremely critical for pluralism. Of course, there are other factors that drive pluralism. You can talk about economic development, and I think the center has actually developed a very holistic perspective on the drivers of pluralism. A perspective that addresses not just the political institutions, but also livelihoods. It addresses civil society. It addresses culture, history, memory, international, the international dimensions and international dynamics. So you have a whole lot of issues. But for me, working as a political scientist, I think having a state, having accountable government, having the rule of law are extremely critical for pluralism. Some may think that is a perspective that is too political, but even economists are now saying that to have economic development, the most critical factors are really the political institutions. That the difference between poor societies and wealthy societies is really the quality of their governance or their political institution. And I would also say that in terms of a peaceful or violent multi-ethnic societies, the difference is, in my view, the quality of political development, the quality of governance, whether they have a state, whether they have a rule of law, and whether they have accountable government. So I think that is an extremely critical factor. And picking up from what I've just said, I think when you don't have a state, when you don't have a state that has the monopoly of violence, I think that could be a serious obstacle. It means you have ethnic militias. In fact, there's a theory of ethnic violence that says, people become communities become very violent when they can no longer trust the state to protect them. So they resort to self-help, and then you have these genocides, this ethnic cleansing. So I think, if you don't have a state, if you don't have accountable governance, and if you don't have the rule of law, those will be serious, monumental obstacles to pluralism, to the constructive, management of diversity, to the peaceful coexistence of groups. So I will argue that, when you don't have a state, when you don't have the rule of law, when you don't have accountable government, that could be monumental, obstacles to peaceful intergroup or intercultural coexistence. I think economic anxieties and intercultural anxieties interact in many societies through the political process. When you have a political process that discriminates in the allocation of resources between groups, then you could find, high levels of inter-ethnic polarization. And I speak from the Nigerian experience, where you have a resource-rich part of the country, but which also happens to be a minority, an ethnic minority, that is in the Niger Delta. And for many years, you had this, very polarizing conflict between the Niger Delta and the rest of the country. And at the root of that conflict was the way in which the political process denied an oil-rich community of the resources and of the benefits of their natural resources. And in fact, it turned that into a cost because they suffered environmental damage. And so they were paying a high price for being oil-bearing communities. And there is, at the root of that was the political process, that turned economic benefits into, a huge disadvantage to the community. So I think political processes that are unfair, that are unaccountable, can, be, the driver of, this, this confluence of economic and cultural anxieties. I think the political world is replete with examples of creative and constructive combination of nationhood and, and diversity. And, there are several policies. One, I think, is to recognize the nation as a multinational community, not a mono-ethnic community. I think there should be an acceptance that nationhood doesn't have to be defined in a monolithic manner, that you could have, multinational states, that is states that are made up of, multiple communities rather than one community. And we've seen that experiments in places like Spain, in Canada. We have excellent models of defining the state, not in a monolithic manner, but in a multi-ethnic, as a multi-ethnic community. Beyond that, I think there are several policies. Decentralization is a good policy, whereby you have resources and powers devolved from national to subnational levels of government. Principles of proportional representation, principles that protect minorities from being overridden, that protects minorities from having their basic fundamental interest overridden by majorities, are also a good example. So you have, I think the literature and the world of policy has a repertoire of policies that are designed to ensure that states are defined in a multinational manner rather than in a mono-ethnic way. I think it does. I think it does because, in political science, we distinguish often between symbolic matters and matters that are more economic. In symbolic matters, it's so difficult to arrive at a peaceable solution because these are really deeply felt issues. Whereas in economic conflicts, you could actually just, arrive at some equitable ways of dividing resources to appease communities. But symbolic matters can be very challenging because they touch on the fundamental values of people, and they can be very, irrational. So I think religion, religion does pose a fundamental challenge to peaceable management of intergroup relations, precisely because of the symbolic nature of our religious identities and religious loyalties. I think it does. Religious mobilization can challenge the model of the secular state, but it doesn't have to be that. And I think, the important thing to recognize in order to prevent, religious mobilization from, undermining, the stability of our multi-religious states is, one, to promote this idea of religion as actually multivocal. That it is not monolithic. In every religious community, whether Christian or Muslim, you find multiple voices. And I think the danger is trying to impose a monopoly on that multiplicity. One point I would like also to make is, this idea of the secular state. I think for some societies, the idea of the secularity of the state, if it is defined as creating a strict separation between religion and the state, can be very unsustainable. So instead of a secular state defined in terms of the separation of religion and the state, I would rather support a model of a multi-religious state that invests equally or equitably in the religious interest and obligations of its different communities. I say this because this is a big debate in Nigeria. Do you have a secular state? Is the state secular or is it multi-religious? And the idea is that, in multi-religious settings, especially societies that have Muslim populations, the state should be defined in terms of its multi-religious character, rather than as a state that is separated from the religious obligations and the religious values or commitments of its constituents.